So there will be two more diseases left in Lecture 12, and the first one is polio or poliomyelitis. This is a famous disease well known for many, many decades, and this was the first major success story of a vaccine stopping a disease. So polio is not very common in the world anymore, but it was widely feared because it would happen in big outbreaks, and people knew that if they got polio, if a kid got polio, there was a chance they would be paralyzed for life, or a chance that their diaphragm would be paralyzed and they wouldn't ever be able to breathe without help. That would be the extreme outcomes. Certainly not everybody would experience that, but when we know that's a possible outcome of getting infected, we don't want to get infected. So you might have read stories written by older people about remembering how their lives were disrupted by the outbreaks of polio, and how they wouldn't be able, as children, they wouldn't be able to go outside and do fun children things in the summer because their parents were afraid that they would get polio. And so when COVID hit, I remember several people said this was really the only big epidemic that would slow down society a lot that people could really remember. So this was a big deal, and it still would be if not for the vaccine. So what would typically happen that made it mysterious was that there would be at least 1 week, if not 3 weeks, between exposure and getting any symptoms, and most people wouldn't get any symptoms. So that may sound familiar to you. Asymptomatic spread is what lets a disease spread very fast, very widely, because people don't know who to avoid. Smallpox, people know who to avoid. But polio, COVID, HIV, the herpes viruses, if you don't know who to avoid, you can't avoid the right people. And anyway, we don't want to be avoiding people. We want to be curing diseases. So this would spread and cause kind of a GI disease with fever and nausea, and then eventually a quick, complete recovery. But a subset of the people would get more severe symptoms, like meningitis would come back later, and then some of them would get paralysis. And so it would be a very small percentage who had the extreme symptoms, but during a big outbreak where a lot of patients are asymptomatic, lots of people have been exposed to this disease, and so there would be numbers of famous cases of people being paralyzed by this disease. And so we also know that people who had it are at risk of relapses. There were multiple strains of polio, and the vaccine protects against all of them, or it has to. There were two major types of vaccines. One was the inactivated virus, so a virus that cannot replicate at all. It's like parts of a virus or a killed virus. And as a vaccine, this presents the spike proteins, the capsid proteins, and all that to the immune system, so that the immune system can mount adaptive responses to those things. Sometimes people think that a attenuated virus is better because it's a virus that is maybe missing an essential gene. It's able to replicate, but not maybe replicate in all the same cells, not replicate as fast. And the idea is a person would be exposed to that longer. The immune system would have a better chance of forming a response to it. There are a lot of different types of vaccines, and we never know how well they're going to work. We never know what's the best kind is going to be until we've tried them, because the details of our immune responses are still beyond us. We cannot predict exactly what our immune responses will do. So this was the famous story where there were some bad lots of vaccines and some people got infected with polio. And so that's where now we have strict controls over what kinds of studies you can do and what kind of manufacturing processes you can use to prevent that. So the way we make vaccines now is much better than what we did back then. So yeah, if you read the history of polio, it is scary, and you can appreciate the better world we live in now. So since we do have effective vaccination against polio, we can try to eradicate it. And in the last 50 years, we pretty much have made it rare. So by 2013, a lot of people thought we were going to eradicate polio, and then we had a lot of setbacks. So the countries where polio still happens are countries that don't trust other countries, where people who go in as vaccination teams are at risk of being murdered. So we may never eradicate another disease just because humans don't trust each other anymore. So things like public health aren't going to work very well in the future. But we did a good job with smallpox, and we have mostly done away with polio. And at least if we can eradicate it, we can stop major outbreaks with the vaccines we have, if people are willing to take them. So we are always afraid that there will be more polio outbreaks. But again, this is something that we can respond to if we have to. So here you can see details of sort of how it works. Basically, the virus has to spread from the different parts of the body to the neurons if it's going to cause disease. And in most cases, that wouldn't happen. But if it happens to get to the ventral horn cells, these are, as you know, the cells. Well, these are where signals are being generated as part of motor neurons telling muscles to contract. And so if those are damaged, that leads to paralysis. And if paralysis happens to the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles, then a person will not be able to breathe. And so that's why people would use iron lungs. That's why these existed, and still to some extent, I guess, do exist. And there have fairly recently been people who still live in iron lungs. And the idea is a person would be inside this with their head sticking out, and this would increase and decrease pressure to force air in and out of their lungs. So the last thing to look at is the new disease that people have seen as the new polio. It's caused by an enterovirus, which is another fecal oral transmitted virus called D68. And this is not a new virus. It was first identified in the 60s. There was a big outbreak of this in 2014, and during that outbreak we saw severe disease in some children. There have been, two more outbreaks. Every other winter there was an outbreak, and so it was a bit of a surprise there wasn't an outbreak in 2020, but you can remember that in 2020 we have been social distancing and wearing masks and avoiding each other. So we don't know whether this really is something that would have an outbreak every other year under normal circumstances or not. What we do know is it can be very common. We don't have a clear sense of how common it is because we don't test the cause of respiratory illnesses in most kids. We just know when it's severe enough that researchers are asked to identify it, then we can identify it. But typically it's not severe. Adults don't seem to notice it. So we either don't get infected or don't have symptoms. And this is in the news because it caused acute flaccid myelitis, which was also had a long, complicated name up until about 2 years ago. But this would be where kids, after they had this viral infection, they would at some point they would get quick onset paralysis of the limbs, and so some children would get this paralysis, and that's what made people think of polio. we don't have a lot of information about this. We don't have numbers for how many people have recovered, or we don't have great data about what recovery has been like. We know there have been 1,000 known cases within the last 12 years. We know it's pretty much everywhere. It's still rare. And so what we know of is there have been hundreds of cases of acute flaccid myelitis. And it would be great to know how to treat these or prevent them, but we don't yet have either of those options. So be aware this is out there, and this is a situation where the best thing we can do to prevent this is to keep kids away from this virus. And that is it for lecture 12. This is I think it's a peaceful picture of a sleeping cat. And the idea is we do need to take care of our brains. And when we learn long lists of horrible things, it takes us to horrible places in our brains. And it's a good idea to have things you like that are comforting that you can think about after you're done thinking about rabies and polio and leprosy and sepsis and botulism and tetanus and anthrax and all the other things we learned about in lecture 12. So hang in there and remember the types of questions you are preparing yourself to answer on the exam. I'm not expecting you to know all these details. I'm expecting you to know the things I talked about at the beginning of lecture 11. So look for those things, and I will see you later.